In August of 1987, Michael Jackson stood at the edge of the most dangerous moment in his career. Not a scandal, not a controversy, something quieter and in some ways more brutal. The follow-up album. 5 years earlier, he had released Thriller. It sold over 100 million copies. It became the best-selling album in the history of recorded music. It made him, by most measures, the single most famous human being on the planet. And now the industry wanted to know one thing. Could he do it again? Michael's answer was an album called Bad. On the surface, it looks like a victory lap. 5 number-one singles. A record no album had ever produced before or since at that point. A world tour. A short film directed by Martin Scorsese. But underneath that success sits a much stranger, much heavier story. A story about a 28-year-old man trying to prove in front of the entire world that he was more than the sum of what other people had built him to be. Today we're going past the surface of the Bad era. Not the singles, not the moonwalk, not the trivia you already know. We're going into 3 hidden layers of pressure that shaped this album and this man. The corporate cage he grew up inside, the battle over his own body that the public barely understood, and the literal documented machinery the industry used to manufacture his image, piece by piece, until it looked tough enough to sell. Let's start at the beginning. Because to understand why Bad mattered so much to Michael Jackson, you have to understand that this was not the first time in his life someone else was deciding who he was allowed to be. Layer 1, the boy band cage. In 1968, a 9-year-old Michael Jackson stood in front of Motown Records founder Berry Gordy, one of 5 brothers from Gary, Indiana, hoping to be signed. Gordy had already turned down plenty of what he called kid acts. He'd had his fill after Stevie Wonder. But something about this group changed his mind, and on July 26th of that year, Joe Jackson signed his sons to Motown. What happened next is the part most people don't think about when they picture the cheerful bubblegum sound of early Jackson 5 hits like I Want You Back in ABC. Motown didn't just sign the Jackson 5. Motown built them. A team of in-house songwriters known as the Corporation, which included Berry Gordy himself, wrote almost everything the group recorded. The label controlled their choreography, their wardrobe, their public story. Motown's publicity department even circulated a founding myth that Diana Ross personally discovered the group in a nightclub. It wasn't true. It was marketing. And it worked, because almost nobody questioned it for years. Michael was 5 years old when his father began shaping him and his brothers into a professional act. By the time he was a preteen international pop star, he had essentially no experience making a decision about his own art. Every song, every step, every outfit had already been decided by adults running a business. Here's the number that tells the real story. By 1975, after the Jackson 5 had sold more than 60 million records for Motown, the brothers discovered they were earning royalties of just 2.8%. 2.8% on tens of millions of records sold. When they tried to leave for a better deal at Epic Records, which offered them 20%, Motown didn't just object. Motown sued them and won the legal rights to the very name, the Jackson 5. The brothers were forced to rebrand, legally, as the Jacksons, because a corporation technically owned the identity of 5 human beings. Sit with that for a second. The first time in Michael Jackson's life that a corporation asserted legal ownership over his public identity wasn't during the plastic surgery rumors of the 1980s, and it wasn't during the tabloid years. It happened when he was still a teenager over a group name. And before Motown even entered the picture, there was already another layer of control most fans never hear about. Before the Jackson 5 signed with Gordy, they were briefly tied to a small Gary, Indiana label called Steeltown Records, where their father Joe negotiated on their behalf, while the boys, some as young as 8 or 9, performed wherever they could to earn extra money while contract negotiations dragged on. By the time Motown scooped them up, Michael Jackson had already been part of a professional, adult-run business operation for years, without ever really being a child in the traditional sense. The Motown years didn't start his loss of ordinary childhood. They accelerated something that had already begun. Once inside Motown, the touring schedule and recording pace were relentless, all built around maximizing output from 5 young performers whose personal preferences about the music simply weren't part of the conversation. It's worth remembering that Michael Jackson's entire concept of what a career in music looked like was formed inside that system. Sing what you're given, wear what you're given, say what the label's publicity department decided you said. When people later described adult Michael Jackson as a perfectionist who needed absolute control over every creative decision, that instinct didn't come from nowhere. It came from more than a decade of having none. This is the root of everything that follows. When Michael eventually went solo, when he fought for more writing credits on Thriller, when he pushed even harder for creative control on Bad, he wasn't simply chasing artistic ambition for its own sake. He was trying to become the owner of his own story for what may have been the first time in his life. Bad wasn't just an album, it was the latest round in a fight that had been going on since he was a child. Layer 2, the body as battleground. This is the part of the Bad era that gets talked about the least, and it's arguably the most misunderstood chapter of Michael Jackson's entire public life. Somewhere around 1983, right as Thriller was exploding into the biggest album on earth, Michael's dermatologist, Dr. Arnold Klein, began noticing small patches of depigmented skin. By 1986, in the middle of recording sessions for Bad, Klein formally diagnosed Michael with vitiligo, an autoimmune condition that destroys the cells responsible for skin pigment. Around the same time, Michael was also diagnosed with discoid lupus erythematosus, another autoimmune condition. In 1986, vitiligo was barely known to the American public. There was no widespread awareness campaign, no cultural reference point for what people were watching happen to Michael Jackson's skin in real time on magazine covers and concert stages. So the public did what people often do with something they don't understand. They filled in the blanks with the most dramatic explanation available. And the explanation that spread fastest was that Michael Jackson was deliberately bleaching his skin because he wanted to look white. This wasn't a fringe rumor confined to tabloids. It came from serious voices, too. The African-American psychologist Naim Akbar publicly condemned Michael during this exact period, framing his changing appearance as a rejection of his own cultural identity. That's not a gossip magazine headline. That's a trained psychologist on the record, accusing one of the most visible black entertainers in American history of racial self-rejection, at the precise moment his body was changing due to a diagnosed illness he had chosen for reasons of privacy and control, not to publicly explain. And the backlash wasn't only verbal. In parts of Washington, D.C., promotional posters for the Bad album were physically defaced, cut, slashed, spray-painted. People were angry enough at what they believed Michael Jackson's face and skin represented that they vandalized his advertising on the street. Now here's the detail that makes this layer especially painful in hindsight. Michael did not publicly explain any of this until his interview with Oprah Winfrey in 1993, watched by tens of millions of viewers. That means for the entire Bad era, from 1987 through 1989, while he was touring the world, filming videos, doing interviews, and performing 8 or 9 songs a night, he was absorbing an accusation about betraying his own race and community in real time without the one piece of information that could have stopped it. He had vitiligo. He wasn't allowed, medically or strategically, to fully explain that yet. And here's the twist that most people never connect to this story. In 1988, Rolling Stone ran a readers' poll. 23,000 readers voted. Michael Jackson was voted worst male singer, worst dressed, worst male rock artist. And Bad itself was voted worst album of the year, worst single, worst video, and worst album cover. That same year, Bad became the first album in history to produce 5 #1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100, a chart record that had never happened before. So in the exact same 12-month stretch, Michael Jackson was simultaneously breaking a chart record no one had ever broken and being publicly voted the worst artist in music by his own fan base's readership. That contradiction is the entire emotional core of the Bad era. Commercial triumph and public cruelty happening at the same time. About the same album, often about the same man's face. There's another detail worth adding here, one that reframes a piece of Michael Jackson iconography. Most people never connect to any of this. His longtime makeup artist, Karen Fay, later explained that his natural skin tone under the stage lighting and heavy makeup was actually darker than audiences typically saw, because performers of that era often wore extra coverage specifically to protect their skin from the intensity of concert and camera lighting. Even the famous single glove, a signature image from this exact period, has been tied by some biographers to his vitiligo, since the condition can begin asymmetrically on one side of the body before spreading. Whether or not that specific explanation is the full story, it's a reminder that some of Michael Jackson's most recognizable visual choices during the Bad era may have been quiet adaptations to a private medical condition that the public was reading as pure style, or worse, as a confession of self-hatred. Layer 3. Manufacturing toughness. If layers 1 and 2 are about pressure, Michael absorbed from outside forces beyond his control, layer 3 is about the pressure that was applied on purpose, deliberately, by the machinery of the music industry itself to reshape him into something more marketable. Start with a detail that sounds almost too specific to be symbolic, except that it's completely true. During the making of Bad, Michael reportedly wrote a note on his bathroom mirror. 2 words. 100 million. That was his personal sales target. More than double what Thriller had done. Imagine carrying that number around in your own bathroom every single morning while trying to write songs. To hit that target, Michael wrote roughly 62 songs during the Bad sessions. He recorded somewhere around 33 of them in full. At one point, he wanted to release the album as a triple LP, 33 tracks across 3 discs. His producer, Quincy Jones, talked him down. The final album shipped with 11 songs, 62 written, 33 recorded, 11 released. That gap between what Michael actually created and what the industry allowed onto the shelf is one of the clearest, most measurable examples of pop conformity pressure in his entire career. The relationship with Quincy Jones itself became a real battleground during these sessions. Michael wanted the crisp, polished, synthesizer-driven sound of new digital technology. Jones, coming from a background in jazz and live orchestration, wanted more organic instrumentation. At one point, Jones discovered that Michael had secretly gone back into the studio and altered tracks Jones had already finished, restoring his own preferred digital sound without telling him. Jones was furious enough that he temporarily walked off the project. They eventually reconciled, but Michael later reflected on the tension in his own words, saying that they felt like they were competing with themselves. That's a rare moment of Michael speaking plainly about what the pressure to follow up Thriller actually felt like from the inside. Then there's a detail almost nobody knows, and it might be the single best piece of evidence for the entire theme of this video. The first version of the Bad album cover was scrapped entirely. The original shoot was reportedly considered too soft, too vulnerable, at odds with the tougher, streetwise image the label wanted to sell alongside the album's title. So the final cover, the one you actually know, Michael in black leather, chains, buckles, was hastily reshot right after he finished filming the Bad music video. The literal cover art of the album was rejected and redone specifically to make him look tougher, because the version that reflected something softer wasn't considered commercially viable. That decision extended into the album's most expensive piece of marketing. Michael Jackson hired Martin Scorsese, fresh off directing Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, to direct an 18-minute short film for the title track. Written by novelist Richard Price and shot on location in Brooklyn, the film cast Michael as a character named Daryl, a private school student who returns to his old neighborhood and has to prove to his former gang that success hasn't made him soft. It's visibly inspired by West Side Story. It is, functionally, a manufactured toughness narrative built by one of the most respected filmmakers in America, designed to convince the public that Michael Jackson could still be believable as Bad. There's a small but telling footnote here too. Michael originally wanted the title track to be a duet with Prince, his only real commercial rival at the time. Prince turned it down, reportedly because he wasn't comfortable with the song's opening line, which meant Michael had to carry the entire tough guy concept completely alone, without another star's credibility attached to share the risk. The lead single tells a similar story about how much of Bad was shaped by other people's calculations before Michael's own instincts won out. I just can't stop. Loving You was originally planned as a duet as well, following the model of pairing Michael with a major guest star, the way Paul McCartney had appeared on Thriller's The Girl Is Mine. Whitney Houston was reportedly considered for the part before scheduling conflicts made it impossible. The role eventually went to Sida Garrett, a largely unknown songwriter from Quincy Jones's stable of collaborators, who also ended up co-writing Man in the Mirror. It became the album's first #1 hit anyway, proving that some of the label's original commercial instincts about needing a famous name attached weren't actually necessary at all. Smooth Criminal has its own strange origin story that shows just how much creative material got reshaped and merged under pressure to fit a marketable concept. The song began as 2 completely separate ideas, one inspired by the gangster glamour of 1930s Chicago, at different points literally titled Chicago 1945 and Al Capone, and the other, a much darker track Michael had written with serial killer Richard Ramirez in mind. The 2 ideas were eventually fused into the menacing, tightly wound single fans know today, complete with a recording of Michael's own heartbeat woven into the opening. Quincy Jones reportedly didn't even want the song on the album at all, and Michael had to fight to keep it in, which tells you that even within his own camp, Michael's most artistically distinct ideas were often the ones facing the most resistance. And then there's the industry's own scorecard, which delivers maybe the clearest single proof of how disconnected critical validation was from what Bad actually achieved. At the 1988 Grammy Awards, Michael was tied for the most nominations of any artist outside the classical categories, including nominations for Album of the Year and Producer of the Year alongside Quincy Jones. He walked away with 0 wins in the major categories that night. Album of the Year went to U2's The Joshua Tree instead. The moment was notable enough that legendary performer Little Richard, present at the ceremony, told reporters he was shocked and stunned and said plenty of people in the room felt the same way. An album that would go on to produce a record 5 #1 singles, more than any album in history up to that point, walked out of the industry's biggest night with nothing to show for it. And none of this pressure to conform started with Bad. It has roots that stretch back to Thriller, and even earlier in the industry's basic assumptions about what a black artist was allowed to do in mainstream American media. In 1983, MTV, a channel built almost entirely around white rock programming, initially refused to air the video for Billie Jean. It took CBS Records president Walter Yetnikoff threatening to pull every single CBS artist off the network before MTV relented. Michael Jackson had already been forced, years before Bad, to prove that a black artist's video could even exist inside a format built specifically to exclude him. By the time Bad came around, the stakes of controlling his own image weren't abstract to him at all. They were something he had already fought for, in public, against one of the biggest media companies in the country. So, when you put these three layers together, a different picture of the Bad era starts to form. This wasn't simply Michael Jackson deciding to reinvent himself for fun, or chasing a new sound because trends had shifted. This was a man who had spent his entire childhood inside a corporate machine that owned his output and even his name. A man whose own changing body, the result of a diagnosed illness, was publicly read as a betrayal of his own race years before he was able to explain it. And a man whose record label literally rejected and reshot his album cover because it looked too gentle, then hired one of America's greatest crime filmmakers to manufacture a tougher version of him for the world to buy. There's one more piece of this story worth sitting with before we close. Buried on the same album as all of this manufactured toughness is a song called Man in the Mirror. It wasn't written by Michael at all. It came from songwriters Sita Garrett and Glenn Ballard, brought to him late in the process when the label wanted something with the emotional weight of We Are the World. And of all 11 tracks on Bad, it's arguably the only one that isn't wearing a costume. No gang persona, no tough guy posture, no leather jacket concept. Just a direct, plain request for the listener, and maybe for Michael himself, to start with self-examination before asking the world to change. It's worth noticing that the one moment of real vulnerability on this album wasn't something Michael manufactured to sell records. It was something almost accidental, brought to him by other writers at the 11th hour, that ended up outliving nearly everything else from that era in the culture's memory. Bad went on to sell somewhere around 9 million copies worldwide within its first 10 weeks. It produced 5 number-one singles, a chart record that took decades for anyone else to match. Michael was later honored by Billboard specifically for that achievement and given Lifetime Achievement recognitions at the American Music Awards and the Soul Train Awards. By almost any commercial measure, the mission succeeded. But success and peace are not the same thing. The man who wrote 100 million on his bathroom mirror never actually hit that number with this album. Even while breaking chart history, the man whose skin was changing due to a diagnosed illness spent years absorbing accusations about his identity that he wasn't ready to correct. And the man who had spent his whole life fighting to own his own image ended up having his album cover rejected and rebuilt by other people anyway, because even at the height of his fame, total creative control was still something he had to negotiate for, song by song, photo by photo. That's the real complexity hiding underneath the Bad era. Not just a boy band star becoming an independent artist. A lifelong negotiation over who actually gets to decide who Michael Jackson is. The label, the public, the press. Or every once in a while, when the machinery loosened its grip just enough, Michael himself.